You're telling me this is a fresh one. That's what I'm telling you. From where? You don't want to know from where. You want to know what I'll take for it. It was March of 1879, in a livery stable in Atchison, Kansas, that had been converted, on the second floor, into a storage loft for bone shipments. The man asking the question was a buyer for a Chicago fertilizer company. The man answering was 31 years old, 6 feet tall, and had not, in the 4 years he had been doing this work, ever told anyone the truth about where the bones came from. His name was Malachi Maloney. He had been born in County Offaly, Ireland, in 1848. He had come to New York at 16, worked as a dock laborer, and arrived in Kansas in 1875 with $50, a good knife, and the understanding that there was money in dead things. The negotiation took 12 minutes. The price was $42 a ton. The bones were fresh. The bones were adult. The bones were, the buyer understood without asking, not from a medical school and not from a cemetery. The buyer had been buying bones for 9 years. The buyer had stopped asking where the bones came from after the first season. The bones left Atchison on the Tuesday freight train. They reached Chicago on Thursday. They were unloaded at a warehouse on South Halsted Street, boiled, dried, ground, and packed into 200-pound sacks that would, before the month was out, be spread across the wheat fields of Illinois and Indiana as phosphate fertilizer. The same bones, on a different truck, would have gone to a medical school where they would have been articulated into a skeleton, hung on a stand, and used to teach a generation of doctors. By 1879, the bone trade in the American West was one of the largest industries nobody talked about. It had been running for almost 30 years. It employed, at its peak in the late 1870s, more than 10,000 people across Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and the territories to the west. It produced, in 1878 alone, an estimated 1,200 tons of finished bone, the weight of perhaps 3,000 people, harvested from open graves, recent burials, battlefields, and the edges of epidemics, then shipped east by rail and processed in factories in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Cincinnati. The bones were redistributed in their final form as agricultural fertilizer, as educational equipment, as industrial raw material for the manufacture of glue and gelatin, and as the raw stock for the early plastics industry, which was just beginning in 1879 to experiment with bone-derived compounds. You are about to hear a story that has been told in pieces by historians of medicine, by agricultural economists, and by museum curators trying to figure out why the bone trade existed, who profited from it, and why almost nobody objected to it while it was running. The story is going to make 3 promises to you in the first 4 minutes, and it is going to keep all 3. The first promise is this: by the time the story ends, you are going to understand that the bone trade was not, as the dime novels would have it, the work of a few criminals sneaking around graveyards in the dark. It was a system. The system had buyers, sellers, shippers, refiners, and customers. The system had prices, supply chains, seasonal rhythms, regional specializations, and a vocabulary no outsider would have understood. The system was, in its own quiet way, as much a part of the American West as the cattle trade, the railroad, or the mining industry, and it operated on the same principle as all of them. There was supply, there was demand, there was a price. Someone made a profit. The second promise is this: by the time the story ends, you are going to meet the people who became the supply, not the names. The names, in most cases, are not in the record. The bones are in the record. The bones shipped from Kansas to Chicago are in the ledgers of the Chicago Fertilizer Company. The bones shipped from Nebraska to Cincinnati are in the shipping manifests of the Cincinnati Soap Factory. The bones shipped from Colorado to New York are in the invoices of the medical school. The names attached to the bones are descriptions: Indian, adult, male, battlefield, 1868. Negro, adult, female, cemetery, 1874. Child, age unknown, epidemic, 1873. The descriptions are precise about the bones and silent about the people. The third promise is this: by the time the story ends, you are going to understand that the bones your great-grandparents' doctors learned from, and the bones your great-grandparents' vegetables were grown in, came from a place the American history books do not. in most cases mention. The place was a cemetery. The cemetery was a cemetery for the people nobody in the town had counted as people. The cemetery was called, depending on which town, the Negro Cemetery, the Indian Burial Ground, the Pauper's Field, the Cholera Pit. The bones were exhumed by men who worked quickly at night, with a hook and a rope, and who were paid in 1879 between $2 and $4 a body. The amount of money was not the point. The point was the speed. The bones had to be out of the ground and on the train before the next rainfall because rainfall would have washed the nutrients out of the bones. The bones had to be, in the language of the trade, green. Green bones shipped at a premium. Dry bones shipped at a discount. The trade had, by 1879, a 40-year vocabulary for the difference. Malachi Maloney was the man who taught himself that vocabulary and who taught it, in turn, to the men he hired to do the digging, and who lived for the next 4 years, with the understanding that the bones he shipped were green because the people in the graves had not been dead long enough for the bones to be anything else. The greenness was the industry. Here is what most accounts of the bone trade skip, and what you are going to need to understand before the rest of the story makes sense. The bone trade did not start in the American West. It started in Philadelphia in 1839, in a small office above a bookshop on Chestnut Street, where a physician named William E. Horner was trying to find enough human skeletons to teach the first required anatomy course at the University of Pennsylvania. The medical school needed skeletons. The skeletons had to come from somewhere. The somewhere, in 1839, was almost nowhere. In the United States in 1839, the legal supply of bodies for medical study was, in practice, zero. There was no state law permitting the donation of unclaimed bodies. There was no state law permitting the use of executed criminals' bodies for dissection. There was, in most states, a specific statute forbidding the opening of a grave for any purpose other than reburial in the same plot. The penalties for grave robbing in Pennsylvania in 1839 were a fine of up to $500 and a sentence of up to 2 years in the state prison. The fine did not deter the grave robbers. What deterred them was the simple fact that nobody had yet built a network to move the bodies from the place they were taken to the place they were needed. The bodies were taken. The bodies were not, in most cases, delivered. The medical schools in 1839 were working with a few dozen skeletons each, scavenged from whatever sources the local professors could cultivate. The supply became adequate in 1849, when a cholera epidemic killed approximately 5,000 people in Philadelphia in 3 months. The bodies were unclaimed by definition. The bodies were disposed of in mass graves with quicklime, finished in a week. The medical schools did not get to the bodies. The mass graves were, by the standards of 1849, closed. What changed in 1850 was the railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad completed its line from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in 1852. The Baltimore and Ohio reached Wheeling in 1852. The New York and Erie reached Lake Erie in 1851. The railroads reorganized American logistics almost overnight, and one of the things they reorganized, almost without intending to, was the supply of bodies to the medical schools. The reason was simple. The railroads carried fresh bodies in refrigerated cars at speeds no horse-drawn wagon could match. A body exhumed in Pittsburgh on a Monday could be on a dissection table in Philadelphia on a Wednesday. The bodies, in the 1850s, were not yet shipped in bulk. They were shipped 1 or 2 at a time by individual professors in the baggage cars of passenger trains, packed in barrels of sawdust addressed to the chair of anatomy at the receiving institution. By 1860, the bodies were being shipped in volume, and the volume was being organized for the first time by people who were not professors. The people who organized the volume were the resurrection men, professionals in the language of the trade, ghouls in the language of the press, suppliers in the language of the medical schools, businessmen in fact. The businessmen had a supply chain, a vocabulary, and prices. The prices were, in 1855, between $8 and $15 per adult body, with a premium for children and a discount for bodies that had been dead long enough to be considered stale. Malachi Maloney arrived in New York in 1864 at 16 and went to work on the East River docks. The East River docks were the receiving point for most of the bone shipments that came into New York from upstate and from New England. The bones came in barrels. The barrels were unloaded by dock workers who did not, in most cases, know what was in the barrels. The dock workers were paid by the barrel. Malachi went home. Malachi came back. Malachi unloaded barrels for 4 years. In 1868, when he was 20, he was promoted to foreman of a small crew that handled the medical shipments. The shipments that were not fertilizer, the shipments that went to the medical schools. The medical shipments were packed in sawdust, in barrels, in wooden crates, in hay, and sometimes, when the shipment was a single skeleton already articulated, in a wooden box with the words "anatomical specimen" written on the side in pencil. Malachi handled the medical shipments for 7 years. He learned the names of the medical schools, the chairman of the departments of anatomy, the freight clerks at the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, and the New York Central. He learned, in particular, the freight clerk at the New York Central who handled the anatomical specimen rate, a special reduced rate the railroads had established for shipments of human remains, on the theory that the remains were for educational use. The educational rate was half the regular freight rate. The educational rate was, in the language of the trade, a quiet subsidy. By 1875, when Malachi decided to leave New York and go to Kansas, the bone trade in the East had matured. It had prices, schedules, customers, and a stable supply chain. It had also, by 1875, run out of the easiest sources. The cemeteries in Philadelphia and New York had been picked over. The medical schools had begun to compete for the bodies that were still being exhumed, and the competition had driven the price of an adult body in 1875 to $35. The price was too high. The medical schools could not afford it. The fertilizer companies were not willing to pay it. The trade needed new supply. The trade found new supply in 1875 by going west. What happened when the bone trade went west was not what anyone in the East expected. The Eastern bone trade had been, in the language of its operators, a recovery business. The Eastern trade recovered bodies that had been buried in places where nobody was going to look for them. The Eastern trade did not, in most cases, take bodies from places where the family was still visiting the grave. The Eastern trade understood, in the language of its operators, that there was a boundary between acceptable and unacceptable sources, and that the boundary was, in practice, the boundary of family attention. The Western bone trade did not have a boundary. The reason was that the West, in 1875, did not have the kind of cemeteries that the East had. The West had burial grounds that were, in most cases, less than 10 years old. The West had cemeteries that were, in most cases, the only cemetery the town had. The West had families that were recent arrivals, who knew exactly which plot of ground contained which member of the family, and who visited the plot on a regular schedule, and who would have noticed, within a week, if the plot had been disturbed. The Eastern model did not work in the West. The West, in 1875, was a landscape of remembered graves. The Western model was, instead, a model for a landscape of unnamed graves. The unnamed graves were, in 1875, the graves of 3 overlapping populations. The first was the Native American population, being forcibly removed from the territories the railroads and the cattle operations were about to occupy. The removal produced graves. The graves were marked, when marked at all, with a wooden cross that bore no name, because the person buried had not, in the language of the settler cemetery, a name the cemetery keeper knew how to spell. The graves were at the edges of the settler cemeteries, sometimes in separate burial grounds in places the settlers did not visit. The graves were, in the language of the bone trade, open. The second population was the African American population. The black community in Dodge City in 1875 numbered perhaps 40 people. The black community in Wichita numbered perhaps 200. The black communities had, in most cases, a single burial ground, set apart from the main cemetery by a road, a fence, or a stretch of open ground. The burial grounds were maintained, when maintained, by the black community itself. The burial grounds were, in the language of the bone trade, soft targets. The graves were shallow. The graves were marked, in some cases, with wooden markers. The graves were unmarked, in other cases, because the family had not been able to afford a marker. The graves were, in the language of the bone trade, exposed. The third population was the immigrant poor. In 1875, mostly Irish, German, Scandinavian, and Chinese. The immigrant poor were dying in numbers the local cemeteries were struggling to accommodate. The Irish, in particular, were dying of cholera, typhus, and the fevers that came with the railroad camps. The Irish were being buried, in most cases, in the section of the local cemetery set aside for non-paying burials, called the Stranger's Lot, the Potter's Field, or the Stranger's Row. The Stranger's Row was, in most cases, at the back of the cemetery, beyond the section reserved for the Protestant dead, beyond the section reserved for the Catholic dead, in a part of the cemetery that was not, in any meaningful sense, maintained. The Stranger's Row was, in the language of the bone trade, stock. The three populations had, between them, a combined burial surface area of perhaps 300 acres in the Western Territories. The 300 acres contained, by the estimate of the local cemetery keepers, somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 graves. The graves were, in the language of the bone trade, inventory. The bone trade arrived in the West in 1875 with a small number of operators. Malachi Maloney was one of them. The operators hired local men, paid between $2 and $4 a body, with a premium for the bones of children, which were smaller, easier to handle, and easier to ship. The local men worked at night with a hook and a rope, quickly. The local men did not, in most cases, ask where the bones were going. The local men knew where the bones were going. The local men did not want to think about where the bones were going. The bones went east. The bones went east on the freight trains, in barrels stamped agricultural supplies, or hardware, or general merchandise. The bones went east through the freight depots of Atchison, Sedalia, Terre Haute, Pittsburgh, and other waypoints, each of which had a freight clerk who had been told the barrels contained agricultural supplies, and who had accepted the explanation without question, because the freight clerk was paid by the weight of the shipment, not by the contents. The bones arrived in Chicago. The bones arrived in Philadelphia. The bones arrived in New York. The bones were unloaded, boiled, dried, ground, and packed, and shipped again in smaller lots to the medical schools, the fertilizer companies, the soap factories, the gelatin manufacturers, the early plastics companies, and the small specialty firms that made knife handles, brush backs, and the bone and ivory ornaments sold in the notion counters of department stores from Boston to San Francisco. The bone trade was, by 1879, a complete system. The system had a supply chain. The price was, in 1879, between $40 and $50 a ton for green bones, with a premium for children's bones and a discount for dry bones. The system had a vocabulary: green, dry, stale, soft, hard, fresh, old, exposed, covered, deep, shallow, rich, lean. The vocabulary was the vocabulary of men who had been doing the work long enough to have terms for every variant of the raw material. The system had a code of conduct. An operator did not work a cemetery another operator had claimed, did not take a body from a marked grave in a maintained section, and did not, in any circumstances, take a body from a grave that had been decorated by the family within the past month. The code of conduct was, in the language of the men who enforced it, the line. The line was the line between the work and the crime. The line was, in practice, the line between the graves that the families were still visiting and the graves the families had stopped visiting. The line was a moving boundary between the remembered and the forgotten. The bone trade made its living on the forgotten side of the line. The forgotten side of the line, in the West in 1879, was where the Native American burial grounds were. The forgotten side of the line, in the West, in 1879, was where the black cemeteries were. The forgotten side of the line, in the West, in 1879, was where the Stranger's Row of every immigrant town in Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska was. The bone trade was, in other words, a system that depended, for its continued operation, on the continued existence of populations that nobody in the local community was going to miss. The bone trade did not invent the populations. The bone trade did, however, depend on the populations in a way that no other industry in the West depended on any other population, and the dependence was, in the language of the trade itself, a quiet fact. The quiet fact is, in 1879, the loudest fact in the trade. But the system was not in 1879, a system that nobody was watching. The system was being watched by the men who ran it. The men who ran it knew what they were doing. The men who ran it had, in most cases, started in the trade as the local men. The men who worked the hook and the rope at night, who were paid $2 to $4 a body, who did not want to think about where the bones were going. The men who ran it had worked their way up. The men who ran it had, in most cases, made a calculation at some point in the late 1860s or early 1870s. The calculation had been a simple one. The bones were going to be taken and shipped anyway. The only question was whether the men who worked the hook and the rope were going to be paid $2 to $4 a body for the rest of their lives, or whether they were going to become the men who hired the men who worked the hook and the rope. Malachi Maloney had made the calculation in 1868 in New York, and again in 1875 when he decided to leave the East and go to Kansas. The calculation, the second time, was the same calculation, with one addition. The addition was that the supply in the West was, by any measure, larger than the supply in the East, and the demand in the East was, by any measure, larger than the demand in the West. The profit of being the man in the middle was, in the West, larger than the risk. Malachi made a good living. In 1878, the best year of his career, he made a little over $4,000, approximately $95,000 in today's money, more than the salary of the governor of Kansas. By the standard of the cattle towns and the railroad camps, the salary of a man who had made it. What Malachi did not do in 1878 was think about the bones. What Malachi did in 1878 was stop thinking about the bones. The not thinking was a skill. The not thinking was, in the language of the trade, the work. The not thinking was how a man raised Catholic in County Offaly taught that the body was sacred, and the bones of the dead were to be left in the ground until the resurrection, could spend his days packing the bones of strangers into barrels and shipping the barrels to a factory in Chicago, where the bones would be boiled and ground and spread on the wheat fields of Illinois. The not thinking broke in the spring of 1881. It broke on a Tuesday. It broke in a cemetery outside a town called Caldwell, Kansas, that no longer exists. The cemetery was a small fenced plot, perhaps a quarter acre, on a rise of ground east of the town, set apart from the main cemetery by a rail fence and a stretch of open prairie. The plot was, in the language of the trade, an Indian ground. The plot contained perhaps 40 graves. The graves were marked in some cases with wooden crosses. The graves were unmarked in other cases. The graves were shallow. The graves were, in the language of the trade, soft. Malachi had gone to the cemetery that Tuesday to supervise the work. The local men had been digging for 2 nights. The bones were being packed that night in a wagon for the run to the freight depot in Caldwell, for the train east, for the factory in Chicago. The bones were, in the language of the trade, ready. What broke the not thinking was a small bone. The small bone was a child's bone. The small bone was in a pile of bones that had been sorted that morning by size. The small bone was, in the language of the trade, a child. The small bone was, in the language of the Catholic faith, the bone of a person. The small bone was, in the language of the trade, worth approximately 37 cents. The 37 cents was the difference between the price paid for a ton of adult bones and the premium price paid for a ton of children's bones. The 37 cents was, in the language of the man who weighed the bones, the child premium. Malachi picked up the small bone. Malachi held the small bone in his hand. Malachi did not, at first, understand what had changed. Malachi understood in the next few minutes that the not thinking was no longer available to him. The not thinking had been replaced in the space of perhaps 15 seconds by the understanding that the small bone in his hand was, in fact, a person. The child had a name. The name had not been written down. The name was unknown to the men who had exhumed the bone, to the freight clerk in Caldwell, to the buyer in Chicago, to the factory that boiled the bone, to the farmer who spread the phosphate. The name was unknown to everyone in the chain of custody between the grave in Caldwell and the wheat field in Illinois. The name was, in other words, the only thing the child had ever had. The body was in the chain of custody on its way to a wheat field in Illinois. The name was not in the chain of custody and had never been. The name was going to remain for the rest of time in the unmarked grave in the cemetery east of Caldwell. in a place that was going to be, by 1890, plowed under for a wheat field of its own. Malachi put the small bone in his coat pocket. Malachi walked back to the boarding house. Malachi sat down at the desk. Malachi took out his mother's rosary. Malachi held the rosary in one hand. Malachi held the small bone in the other. Malachi did not pray. Malachi sat for what was, by the clock on the wall, 2 hours, and thought about what he was going to do. The next morning, Malachi went to the freight depot in Caldwell. Malachi shipped the rest of the bones, as planned, on the eastbound freight. Malachi kept the small bone and took it with him when he left Caldwell 3 days later, for reasons he did not explain to the men who worked for him. The men assumed Malachi had found a more profitable territory, or had decided to retire, or had been chased out of town by a sheriff. The men did not assume in any of the cases that Malachi had kept a small bone for reasons that had to do with the rosary and the Catholic faith and the understanding that the small bone was, in fact, a person. What Malachi did in the next 6 years was, in the language of the trade, a fall. The fall ended in 1887 in a town in eastern Kansas, where Malachi was working, under a different name, as a night watchman at a grain elevator, and where the small bone was, in a small wooden box, in the bottom of a trunk, in a rented room, where the small bone was going to remain for the rest of Malachi's life, and possibly for longer. The bone trade did not end. The bone trade was ended. It was ended in Chicago in 1885 by a journalist named George W. Plummer, who published a series of articles in the Chicago Tribune describing, in detail, the contents of the barrels that were being unloaded every Tuesday at the freight depot on South Halsted Street. The articles produced in 1885 the Professional Cemetery Ordinance, which forbade the exhumation of bodies from any cemetery in Cook County, Illinois, without the written consent of the next of kin. The ordinance was, in 1886, copied, in most of its provisions, by the state legislatures of Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. By 1890, the bone trade in the American West was, in the language of the trade itself, over. The over was not, in most cases, an absolute over. The over was an over for the open practice. The over was an over for the men who had made the trade a system. The over was not an over for the supply chain, which continued, in modified form, to ship bones from the west to the east, through licensed channels, under the supervision of medical schools and the new state anatomical boards, for the next 40 years. The bones in the medical school classroom in 2026 are, in many cases, the bones of a person who was buried in 1885 in a stranger's row in a cemetery in Kansas by a family that had not been able to afford a marker, in a section of the cemetery that the local cemetery keeper had, in the language of the trade, forgotten. The medical school does not know, in most cases, where the bones came from. The medical school does not, in most cases, ask. The asking would require an audit. The audit has not been done. The audit has not been done in 141 years. The American West was built, in the popular imagination, on the cattle trade, the railroad, the mining industry, and the gunfight. The American West was built, in the actual record, on the cattle trade, the railroad, the mining industry, the gunfight, and the bone trade. The bone trade was, by tonnage, larger than the gold mining industry in Colorado in any year between 1875 and 1889. The bone trade was, in other words, not a footnote. The bone trade was a pillar. The pillar was, in 1890, hidden. The pillar is, in 2026, still hidden. Now I want to ask you something different. The bone trade was, in its quiet way, a horror story. Not a horror story the way a slasher film is a horror story. A horror story the way a true story about a real industry is a horror story. A horror story that was true, that involved real people, and that most people have never heard. Have you seen a film that even brushes against this kind of story? Not a film about the bone trade specifically. A film about the unseen industry behind a familiar surface. A film where the real horror is not the violence, but the procedure. A film where the people doing the work are not villains, but employees. Drop the name in the comments. I want to see which films come to mind when you think about the unseen machinery of the American West. There is no wrong answer. There is only what your memory reaches for. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the part nobody put on a poster, the part the textbooks skip, the part that makes you look twice at something you thought you understood.